Ready? Good morning. Can you all hear me? Thank you. Welcome. We're very pleased to see you all here. We'd like to start with just 10 seconds or so of opportunity to kind of center ourselves and prepare to have what Hugh and I hope will be a really fruitful conversation together. So as I've already kind of alluded to, what we're hoping for today is a conversation. This actually is a conversation that Hugh and I have all the time, every time that we meet, and we thought it would be really interesting and hopefully fruitful exercise for us to engage in that conversation together. So what we've done is we have created a collection of questions that we will attempt to answer for you all. And we also ask that the reason that we're putting the questions up on the board, on the projection, is so that the old school teacher in me is like, on the chalkboard, on the projector, is so that you can also contemplate and think about these questions. And we ask that if you want to share your thoughts, that you just throw your hand up and we'll bring a microphone around and we can engage in this conversation together. It's not our intent to tell you how to practically implement ideas around the beloved community within your own personal settings. It's our intention to give you some additional considerations as you think about your role in contributing to the beloved community. Is there anything else you want to add before we?
We envision this very much as a conversation because these are issues that I think are best engaged collectively and that require the input of all of us.
Mm-hmm. So just for introduction, I'm Keona Lewis. I am the Assistant Provost for Academic Diversity and Inclusion here at the University of Notre Dame. I'm also an applied anthropologist, so I will apologize in advance for the way that my worldview is oftentimes broad and sometimes more complicated than it needs to be. It's in me.
I am Hugh Page, Vice President for Institutional Transformation and Advisor to the President, and also a faculty member in the Theology and Africana Studies departments, and I see some of my theology colleagues here too.
Okay, so let's start with the first question. Oh, no, so the format, questions for discussion, and then at the end, if we have time, we can field additional questions that maybe we didn't get to cover. So question one. So probably the most foundational question of the day, what is the beloved community and why do we aspire to create it?
So I'll start, and of course, we owe a great deal to figures like Josiah Royce and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others for their own understanding of beloved community. But when I think of beloved community, I draw on my own experience as a cleric in the Anglican tradition, as a Bible scholar, Hebrew Bible scholar, also an academic administrator. So I think of 10 things. So number one, beloved community is a social aggregate that embraces everyone. Number two, beloved community is committed to an ethic of compassionate care and comprehensive nurture of all of its members. Third, it's ecologically mindful, sustainable, and maximally inclusive. It is an aggregate, a community in which the insider-outsider binary is erased and we all belong. Where the Christian conception of agape is a touchstone, a starting point for the charter of such a community, Sixth, that no one is discardable. Everyone matters. Seventh, human integrity and solidarity, two things that are key touchstones in Catholic social tradition, are central. Eighth, and this is something that I think is at times underappreciated, beloved community is just a little bit messy because it's a teleological journey toward full human actualization of a collective that values individuals and that values the integrity of the community. Ninth, it's an invitation to discover what the late Howard Thurman, who was a mentor of Martin Luther King Jr., called common ground. And then finally, beloved community places the needs of the vulnerable front and center in its ongoing life. So,
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to kind of lean into why we would talk about beloved community at an institution like Notre Dame or at a conference around Catholic social teaching. The reason is because they align so well around ideas of justice and human dignity and caring for the common good, solidarity. All of these are concepts that align perfectly with your definition and our understanding of the beloved community.
I'd agree.
So if we don't have any other questions, comments, I'll move on to number 2. We've spent the last few days together discussing various aspects of religious nationalism and its influence across domains, countries, philosophies, and fields. In considering the beloved community, how have ideas and actions rooted in religious nationalism influenced our understanding of beloved community?
So I went first the last time. I'll yield to you.
I think for me, in a time like, we all live in this world. We know that these are crazy times. It was very divisive. And for me, the foundation in common, those things we have in common, those things that are most important to us, those things that we're committed to together, the areas where we agree, I think that's what will build the beloved community for us. There are things that we all agree are important. And there are things that we have to all work together in order to further the human enterprise in a society. What happens to one inevitably affects us all. So I think that if there's division or preference, I think it undermines our ability to come together and to build the type of community that we actually need to survive. When we think about sustainability, like how are we going to exist on this planet together? These are core foundational principles within the beloved community that we need, apart from our moral imperative to care about these things and to do these things in a way that are positively impactful on the most marginalized.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And let me preface my comments by saying, in the vein of the prophet Amos, I am not an ethicist or the child of an ethicist. And my colleague Jean Porter here is in the audience. So let me just say a couple of things. So Martin Luther King Jr., the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and many others brought the concept of beloved community into conversation with the quest for democracy and equality in the United States and elsewhere. And I think that's something very important to keep in mind. That helps to contextualize, I think, the work that they did and gives us, in a sense, a challenge to continue thinking about how to contextualize this notion within our own setting in this particular portion of the 21st century. Second, the notion of beloved community that King adopted, as I mentioned a few moments ago, was built on Thurman's notions of two things. Number one, the religion of Jesus and what it demanded, a very important construct for Thurman's thinking. And second, how you serve and stand in solidarity with those Thurman considered to be the wall community, those who had their backs against the wall, who had no recourse or voice in a society that had rendered them not only marginal, but also voiceless in many respects. Third, I think we have to keep in mind when thinking about the beloved community, the importance of nonviolence and how King came to understand the doctrine of nonviolence, especially through his own encounter with Mohandas Gandhi, and also through several of the people who were a part of his circle of leadership, like Bayard Rustin, and also Howard Thurman and a number of others. And then finally, I think that there was a sense of urgency, pragmatism, and also hopefulness in King's own understanding of the beloved community, because if you look at some of the quotations of his, where he mentions this and mentions the concept of love, he seems to have been convinced that beloved community was achievable in his lifetime and our lifetime. So it wasn't something that was far afield. It was something that could be worked toward and that could be made manifest through significant effort, albeit on our part, but certainly something that was concrete and manageable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to just pause and just underscore how wonderful it is that you all have this opportunity to have a conversation with you, Paige. His ability to unpack these concepts is bar none, so please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to chime in. Oh, question, yes?
Hi, my name is Iyabo, and I'm an undergrad student here at Notre Dame. I was just wondering how we can kind of find ways that to bring people together. Like, how do we find aspects of each other that are similar between all of us across different backgrounds and across different classes and across different walks of life? As it can be difficult, especially as a person of color on this campus. A lot of the people on the campus are very conservative and do support a lot of Christian nationalism or fascist ideals without really knowing it. So how do I feel comfortable bringing up those conversations and in a safe manner? And how do I bridge the gap between the knowledge that we might have and how we see different things?
I'll start in saying that the first step is being open to building relationships, even in the places where you think maybe there's no common ground. Because what we find is that we are all human, and across the board, I've never met anyone that I didn't have some common ground with. It doesn't mean we're going to always agree, but through building relationships, you're able to build a level of trust if you are a person that I want to build a relationship with, that I can trust that your intentions toward me are fair and equitable and open, and you can trust the same, even if we disagree. So by coming into those conversations and those relationships with that openness to finding an area where we can at least have a conversation, then you get to know the person, and you get to know their heart, and you really get an opportunity to see the value that they bring to your life through this relationship, even if it's in a way that you aren't necessarily familiar with or most comfortable with. But the courage to be open and to be vulnerable in relationships, especially with people that you feel you don't have much in common with, that's the first step in bridging the gap.
Yeah, to build on what Keona has said, I think there are at least two ways to think about building relationship. One involves individual connectivity across difference, and that requires a certain amount of openness, as Keona has said, and also a significant amount of courage and opportunities for those to take place. Second, I think those of us that are in administrative positions have a responsibility to create opportunities structurally for that kind of interaction to occur. And I know that within our Division of Student Affairs, within our residential life system, and also through things that the Provost Office has done with our Office of Institutional Transformation. We've created space for that to happen among faculty and among staff. And we probably need to do a little bit more to create opportunities to fold students into those conversations. But, you know, I think one thing that we've discovered is that through very ordinary things like the sharing of a common meal or the creation of an opportunity for people to gather without an agenda, to get to know one another, that those are ways that relationship can be built and sustained in a meaningful way. But, you know, I don't want you to think that this work is easy. It is work. It requires an awful lot of effort and strategic thinking, especially at a time like this, so that people understand that we're creating space that is safe and where the building of relationship requires a commitment, as a former colleague of mine would often say, a commitment to stay in the room when the conversation gets difficult and when things are said that may be off-putting, realizing that that commitment to stay in the room is a manifestation of beloved community in and of itself.
Hi, my name is Bill Murphy. I've worked in Catholic social teaching for quite a while. My name is Bill Murphy. I work in Catholic social teaching. I wanted to just, picking up on those comments, mention the idea of something many of you might be familiar with, but the history of the early study circles and study weeks of the social Catholics, you know, starting in the mid-1800s with Bishop Kettler in Germany. But that seems to be a model that might work really well to try to recover the idea of a study circle, study group, where you come together to try to look out of our traditions, considered broadly, you know, how do we respond? What are the signs of the times, and how can we respond to that? It seems to me that there's a lot of potential out of that model, that at a place like Notre Dame, it'd be an ideal place, and students, I would think, would really be, you know, great vehicles for that. So anyway, that's just an idea that comes to mind, something related to what I've been working on.
That's a great idea. Yeah. Thank you.
Do you have a question?
Well, thank you. A short question. Yesterday we heard about the sociologist Carl Schmitt, who says there are two logics of democracy. One is liberal logic of democracy, and the other is democratic logic of democracy. And democratic logic of democracy means to have friends and enemies, you know. So how do you connect the beloved community to this understanding that in democracy we need enemies in order to promote our own things?
Now, that's a question about which I have not thought, at least not in terms of enemies versus friends. I have thought a lot about, and I mentioned, the fundamental messiness of beloved community, which means you recognize that not everyone will have the same opinion about salient issues. And I think in some social constructs, dissent is seen as a disadvantage that flies against the vectors of cohesion. In my mind, dissent actually promotes cohesion because you allow people to be fundamentally who they are, to affirm what they happen to believe, to exercise their own conscience. And if you can create a space in which, you know, there's some organizations, for example, that have what's called the tradition of the black hat, when they engage in conversations about really complex stuff. And the job of the person who wears the black hat is to be the loyal opposition, to raise all of the problems, potential problems that might exist with a solution. And I think in beloved community, you need people, whether they're structurally appointed or individually empowered, to say exactly what they think, even if it goes against the grain. And, I think that that's maybe one of the messiest aspects of living in beloved community, because you have to be able to do it and still go out and have a cup of coffee afterward. Or, if it's a really heated conversation, go out and have a beer afterward.
And I would just add that this concept around enemies, is an enemy someone who means to do me harm, or is an enemy just someone whose goals are different from mine? And I think that matters, right? Because just because someone's goals are different from mine doesn't mean we can't do the work to find common ground. Maybe we don't work on this project together because I just don't agree with your goal. But there's this project that's also very important where we can find some common ground and work together. So I feel uncomfortable pitting one side against another and calling people, enemies. I don't feel comfortable with that terminology of the people that I oppose, but I still have respect for. So it's just an additional thought. Mm-hmm.
My name is Amy. I'm an AMBS student, and I'm doing a lot of work with young adults. My question is, I know that for young adults specifically, but I think it's broader than that, a lot of young adults are really online, and in-person communication is very, very intimidating. And so I see that this idea of beloved community is really important in getting young adults to work together and be in spaces together. But a lot of them are really, really intimidated by being in an in-person space, because with people online, they have the anonymity, they can protect themselves, they can also be with people that they agree with. So do you have any suggestions on how to encourage young adults to step out of their comfort zone and be in-person community, in beloved community together?
Yeah, social media is like the elephant in the room, I think, a lot of times with these conversations, because it does allow the opportunity for anonymity. And if you are hiding behind anonymity, how can you really build a good, solid relationship? Maybe you can. I haven't seen it yet. And so maybe one of the brilliant students you work with will create a platform where communication is encouraged in a digital way that allows people to be more open and build real relationships. But in order to really further the goals of a beloved community, a community that's really anchored in agape love, you have to have some vulnerability. There has to be some openness and again, courage to reach out beyond your comfort zone, because this is not always comfortable. It's not always fun. But the commitment to building those relationships has to be there. If there's a way to do that digitally, I think it would be amazing. I haven't seen it yet. So maybe that's something we'll see in the future.
Yeah, maybe there's a way to go from a fully online presence to an actual in-person presence, utilizing some form of digital interpersonal hybridity. I don't have an answer for that one yet. I know that as an internet migrant, I wasn't born when, my first high-tech possession was a manual typewriter. So I text in grammatically correct sentences. And I've been told that for those who are internet natives, that is actually off-putting. So, I have to those of us who represent a different generation have to find ways to bring all of the passion that we have about in-person, interpersonal relationship building into a digital space, which has a completely different set of conventions, and figure out with those who are more comfortable in that space how to negotiate kind of a middle ground, a place where all of us can feel comfortable, because that is still a kind of community. And I think beloved community is probably understood in a slightly different way there. So reaching that general consensus about where we can all be safe is an important step along the way.
Yes, there's a,
My name is Laurie Cassidy, and I just want to hold up LaDonna Harris as an amazing example of this. I so appreciate what you've said, and she embodied this in the 60s and the 70s. Comanche woman who was married to Sam Harris, from the senator from Oklahoma. She continues to live like what you're talking about and believe that having relationships with people across difference is possible, even if you don't like them, even if they consider you an enemy. And the amount of change that she was able to bring about in the Senate and the House of Representatives in the 60s and 70s was amazing. So shout out to LaDonna Harris.
Thank you.
yes. There's a, there's a question over here.
Good morning. I'm Alex McHulich. I wanted to follow up on the question about enemies from a little bit of a different, shifting from an individual response to thinking about culture and structures, in terms of how there's a long history in the United States of this country creating enemies. There's a long list of people and groups that have been created as the enemy, and we're still doing it. We've been doing it since the founding of the nation. So how do we, in witnessing, creating beloved community, respond to that?
That's a really, I spend a lot of time thinking about what my grandfather and my ancestors endured and survived, right? And so I think in that connection to understanding their commitment to love and to making sure that the world was a little bit of a better place, that gives me strength. And it reminds me that even enemies can be friends on topics and issues. There are countless examples of Martin Luther King Jr. working with people who maybe wouldn't have been friends to further the greater goal. And I think just as there are those historical lessons around enemies being created to instill division, to further the goals of certain people, there are equally as many examples of people doing the work to thwart many of those goals and persisting. This is hard work and it's messy work, but I like to look to the examples of people doing the work in the way that I would be proud to be connected to, and try to build, buffers to help persist, even when these things that we know are not healthy and not helpful for humanity seem to be thriving.
Yeah, I don't have anything additional to add to that. I think at points, we simply have to refuse to play the game. No, I'm not your enemy. I don't particularly like what you're doing. I think it's immoral, but I'm going to say that in a loving way, and we're going to move on and try and make the world a better place.
I just have a question for you all too. Keona and Hugh, thank you so much. I just wondered if you could say a word about the importance of embodiedness as part of beloved community, because I think it's a thread underlying what you've already said, and it's been a thread through our conference, and certainly in our reality right now. I think about the various ways that bodies are being, human beings embodied, are being policed. So people being abducted and put on planes and sent to prisons in El Salvador. Other academic institutions like Columbia and Georgetown, students being literally taken and held in detention, not to mention policing the borders. So how do we think about the significance of embodiedness, and not to mention also Martin Luther King Jr.'s own witness of nonviolence, putting his body on the line time after time, Rosa Parks, so many.
So, I think about something that the late Bayard Rustin said. If you ever have an opportunity to see the documentary about his life called Brother Outsider, where he talks about angelic troublemaking. And he advocates the raising up of a generation of people that are willing to put their bodies in places that allow the machinery of oppression not to function. And that is clearly something that those who have practiced nonviolent resistance have made a cornerstone of their practice. But it becomes incredibly dangerous and complicated now, maybe because we see more evidence of it occurring, and it becomes so much front and center part of what we see on the news and experience in daily life. The question really is important when you think about beloved community, because within beloved community, if anything is true, number one, borders are not policed. Number two, membership is not coerced. And so when you see the opposite taking place in other spaces, the question for those who are part of communities that consider themselves anchored in a radical ethic of love is, what do you do? And how do you resist? And I think at this point, those who are committed to making beloved community manifest struggle with that. What are you empowered to do? When and where are you comfortable taking that kind of risk? I think the first thing is to recognize that these things are occurring. The second is to figure out what the most reasonable strategies for mitigation are.
And I think, to your point, strategies, we really have to be strategic in thinking about, so for example, the late Reverend C.T. Vivian told me the story of when he was arrested and the sheriff deputy put a gun to his head. And he put it to the back of his head, and Reverend Vivian said he turned around and he stared him in the eyes and he said, "If you're gonna shoot me, you're gonna shoot me like a man." And the sheriff took the gun and hit him across the head, and he woke up in the jail cell. And so Reverend C.T. Vivian understood at that moment, I'm in a position, and I'm not advocating like martyrdom, but he made the commitment that if something awful were to happen, people will know. That he won't tell them that I was running and he shot me in the back of the head because I was running. They will know. And I think we have to be strategic in how we resist. Because, resistance without any witness, I think, would be even worse. So that's like my little 2 cents in addition to the great comments that he made.
on. I'm Anna Scheid, professor of theological ethics at Duquesne in Pittsburgh. I love what you just said about creative or strategic resistance. I've been thinking a lot about that. But I wanted to ask if either of you have thought about the tradition of truth and reconciliation commissions as a way of having that dialogue across difference, if you think those are effective, if there are maybe practices from any of those that you know of that would be translatable to the US context. Thank you.
You know, I haven't, again, I think it's a great idea. I'm not sure we're at a moment in time where that can happen, because there has to be general agreement about the nature of the current moment. And right now, we see efforts to erase and retell history and to avoid acknowledgement of those things that have resulted in the current slate of inequities that we have in our country and in the world at this point. So I think perhaps, I hope 10 years from now, when we've moved beyond the acrimony and finger pointing that we're experiencing at the present moment have passed, maybe we'll be able to look back at this chapter and other chapters and decide that maybe some honest, compassionate truth-telling would do us all good.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I also struggle with the current moment as it relates to how we talk about truth in the past and even our goals for the future. There's the question here, and then there's one back in the corner, and then two over here.
Yeah, thank you all so much for a great conversation. My name is Jean Porter. I teach here at Notre Dame, and I know Hugh very well. I haven't had the pleasure to meet you yet, but here's what's going through my mind. I remember the civil rights movement. I'm a Southerner, so I remember it from the perspective of what was happening in the South. And I think I feel a need to call to mind just what that was like. That was a time of incredible violence and deep, deep enmity. And it was not a question of people coming together and learning to talk to each other. It was a question of keeping people from killing each other. And that, to put it in that way, implies a reciprocity that wasn't there. It was mostly a question of keeping whites from killing blacks. And you did get responses to that were beautiful and inspiring, and we remember Martin Luther King. We should also remember people like Malcolm X, who really did not have any hope that a peaceful resolution to these problems was possible. And I don't agree with that, but I can see where he was coming from. What troubles me today is that, I never thought I would live to see the day when there was a serious question whether the gains of the civil rights movement were going to outlive me. And I noticed a few days ago, President Trump signed an order legalizing segregation. Once again, it is legal to have segregated facilities in the United States. I never thought I would see that happen. I remember the first Jim Crow. I never thought I would live to see the second Jim Crow. I don't know how to say this in a way that's not too forceful, but I have to say, honestly, I don't think creating the beloved community is our problem right now. I think our problem is a lot more basic and a lot more fundamental and a lot more urgent. We have to find a way to hold the line on hard-won victories going all the way back to the 60s and the 70s. Otherwise, the strains of violence and separation that I think have never left this country are going to come to the fore again. And we're going to live in a world we don't recognize anymore. And I realize that's not a question, that's just a statement, but of course, as is the way with these conferences, I'm inviting comments.
Yeah, I thank you for that comment. I do think that it makes a lot of sense for us to sit with it for a minute and really contemplate kind of the implications of what you've just stated, which are true. I think that the reconciliation and holding the line is something that some people have done since the 60s. There was never a point in my lifetime where I thought we had transcended race and that these issues were no longer a problem. So there's never been a time where I personally have not felt as if I had to hold the line. I think this conversation is important because we do have to talk about that. Whereas me saying that statement among family or friends is not revolutionary. It's not a big deal. It's like, oh yeah, we all know this is what it is. But being able to have that type of conversation in these spaces, I think is really important for building the types of relationships, the type of truth telling, and the type of trust as we continue to not just build the beloved community, but continue to hold the line.
Yeah, like Keona, I don't recall a time in my life when I ever thought the battle was done, where I ever thought that I could let my guard down and trust fully. And that's clearly the case today. I mean, you recognize the social and political stakes that confront you, and you do the work, you cut the deck, as we used to say in playing poker, and you work like it depends all on you. You pray like it all depends on the good Lord. And you try and, at least in my mind, I try and keep in mind the passion and pragmatism of Malcolm X, and the passion and pragmatism and untold stories about Dr. King, who apparently, for a time, did own a rifle. So, you try and keep in mind that building beloved community is messy, that somehow, back in the day, you had to engage virulent, racist thought and thinkers, while knowing that inevitably they didn't have your best interest at heart. But you had to find a way to offer a compelling vision of life on the other side of hatred. And that's really, honest to goodness, that I think is the thing that terrifies me most today, that we know we have to engage those who are fundamentally opposed to liberal, multiracial, democratic thought. And at the same time, think about how to build a community that embraces all of us.
There's a question there. Oh, okay.
I've had the mic for a while.
Oh.
Sorry. Thank you for these last few comments, because I think one of the things that's really missing in this conversation about beloved community is courage and risk-taking and really being uncomfortable, that it's not comfortable to build the beloved community. Here at Notre Dame, we heard yesterday in one of the panels, Palestinian students and those protesting with Palestinian students, really for the inclusion of Palestinians in the beloved community here at Notre Dame, are facing deportation and risk. And as a faculty member here at Notre Dame, I think we need to stand with them and be courageous in insisting on the inclusion of Palestinians in the beloved community, as well as Jewish people who believe that Palestinians deserve to be in that beloved community.
they're also facing threats here. So I just would like to ask you to speak more about the risk-taking that this is going to require of us. We heard yesterday morning, actually, in the plenary too, that in a year we might not be able to even have a public conference like this. How are we going to insist on being courageous enough and taking the risks that it will require of us in the years ahead? Thanks.
Okay. He's doing what I've been doing to him the whole time. I lost the questioner. I'm sorry. Oh, this is the messy and the muddy part. In our mind, practically, there are no borders to the beloved community. All are welcome in the beloved community. But part of building a coalition is hearing the stories and gaining a better understanding of the challenges that each member of the community face. We recently, in one of our DEI practitioner group meetings, we also had a presentation with the undocu ally, right? And so again, these are really young people, everyone, not just young people. We're all facing really challenging times. I firmly believe that being strategic and in some ways pragmatic in our approach and in how and what we choose to highlight, not that we aren't doing the work across the board, but in where we want to place our focus, I think is extremely, extremely important at this very pivotal time. I think when you think about the law and you think about a lawsuit, you look for those points where you have the most likelihood to win, and those are the points that you put forward in your case. It's not that there aren't other points that are morally, important or that maybe could gain you some sway with the judge, but you really want to hone in on those points that you think you have the best foot to win. And I think more information gathering to figure out what those points are is the first step in thinking about how we protect our students, how we protect ourselves, and how we protect our mission here, which I think is equally as important.
There's a quotation on one of our slides for question number
we won't get
number
to today.
8, which we won't get to. But this is a quotation from Howard Thurman, which goes directly to the point that you've raised. He says in Jesus and the Disinherited, the religion of Jesus says to the disinherited, love your enemy, take the initiative in seeking ways by which you can have the experience of a common sharing of mutual worth and value. It may be hazardous, but you must do it. So, and I've read Jesus and the Disinherited multiple times. When I get to that passage, I think, all right, now, you're speaking to the disinherited and you're saying, it's your responsibility to do the work. It's your responsibility to take the high ground and to help mitigate the harm impacting you and really impacting those who are doing the harm. And you must do it. And depending on the mood that I'm in, sometimes I push back and go, but that's a prescription for death. There's no way I can survive that. And I have to sit with it and think about what Keona has said in terms of strategic steps and about courage. And to be perfectly honest, if I apply that standard to my own behavior, at the end of the day when I look in the mirror, I'm not happy with what I see every day. Because there's some times when, the weight of the lift is too much. And you realize, perhaps in hindsight, that you've given away too much and that you haven't done enough, that you haven't been sufficiently bold. But, I think this is where collectively, if we have communities of conscience where these sorts of conversations can go on, then coalitions among those who are experiencing crisis can be built. And from those coalitions, individual fortitude can sometimes be brokered. So it's not an easy thing. In fact, I would say that this is probably the hardest thing any of us will have to do going into the future, knowing when it's okay, when you're okay with the cost, and realizing that sometimes the end of a career, the sacrifice of health, those might all be things that we're called to give. And, frankly, every day of the week, I don't know that any of us is ready to do that.
Good morning. Gretchen Baumgart, Vice President for Mission Integration at Edgewood College in Madison. I work very closely with our DEI officer and in tandem, really. And I'm just curious, in this time of anti-DEI legislation, the Dear Colleague letter, what ways you can see or opportunities for organizing leaders of faith-based institutions to lean into their mission, to lean into values, and not to capitulate to the fear of, it's hard, right? We could lose federal funding, but how do we remain true to our values and our faith and our mission during these times? And strategies for doing that and organizing each other. Thank you.
That is the question of the year so far. We attended the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education conference a few weeks ago, and that was the topic. On the one hand, it's very much encouraging to build, I know I've used this word a million times, but community around like-minded people, and that's what we gained from that. One of the things we gained from that experience at NATAHE is that DEI, whatever you want to call it, the work of making people feel welcome and included is still going on. There, in a lot of ways, that's the resistance, right? There's all of this heavy pressure to stop doing the work that we know our students need, our faculty need, our staff need to know that they are valued and that they are supported here. And so we can't not do the work, but having a coalition of folks who, even if it's secretly, even if it's after the fact, if someone puts their hand on there like, how are you? All of that helps build that community to keep doing the work, irrespective of what it's called. It's the work of it's the peopling, and it's our mission. And so we've tried to rely on that connection to our mission. But at a public institution, you might have to be a little more creative in the interpretation of the mission to lay the foundation for why the work continues to be important.
Yeah, I fully agree with what Keona has said. I think for private institutions, leaning into mission involves, if they're religious institutions, looking at the language in mission statements and other official proclamations and making sure that anything that you do aligns with those statements. I've often thought, the atmosphere, as Keona said, for public institutions is very different. But I think, for example, if you think about the mission of land-grant institutions, one of the things that they're supposed to do is create responsible citizenry, equipped to go into the work world. And if you think about what equips people for responsible citizenship, well, an understanding of civic virtues and how those virtues shape individual behavior and leaven society overall. Now, how do you do that? Well, in a sense, universities have a responsibility to be microcosms of the world that they serve. And if you think holistically and integratively about what it means to be such a microcosm, you can't do so if significant portions of the population are systematically excluded from membership. So I think that there's room for us to intervene in the conversation about what it means to be a productive and responsible public or private institution, and to do so in ways that don't run afoul of the law. You know, by and large, if you look at some of the things that are being said, our laws about discrimination and so forth really haven't changed. But the language around some of the anti-DEI fervor is really, it stokes fear, but it really doesn't change the law.
Hi, I'm Trisha Kuzno. I'm a PhD student at Fordham, but I live in South Bend. I have a really weird, unique perspective as I've been a teacher in public schools and in K-12 schools. So I was at a predominantly Black school in South Bend for 2 years, and then I got started on my PhD, and I switched to a predominantly Catholic school in the area. And something that I've really been struggling with is I studied trauma. And so I think a lot about the beloved community and trauma. And I had the opportunity to go to Belfast this last December and thought a lot about how a lot of my friends in these neoliberal spaces that are white and mostly male are talking about cutting off their families and deleting social media and really isolating themselves in this like neoliberal bubble. And I think about my trans friends that are being forced to be in some of these conversations, or my Black friends that are being forced to be in some of these conversations, or the feminist theologians that are being pushed and like, you have all the answers. So I have a story and then a more in-depth question, but the short story is the day after Trump was elected, I was sitting in the lunchroom at this predominantly white Catholic school, and a student was opening their can of pop, and it got on a white student, and he starts shouting, MAGA, MAGA, deport him, deport him, deport him. I got a bunch of the students to cheer with him, and then immediately they put him in a circle process. It was like, okay, you solve the problem. And that's like not trauma informed whatsoever. And I think something that I get really fearful of when we have these conversations is it's not a person of color's job, it's not a minority's job, it's not a trans person's job to like save the world. And so how can we protect our people in beloved community? How can we protect our vulnerable students? How can we protect those that maybe don't know they need to be protected yet, and still embrace beloved community, but also call us out to something that like, it's kind of our responsibility, those that hold privilege in many different ways. How do we protect people in beloved community while still fostering diversity and care and an ethic of love and social teaching? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for such a thoughtful question. My initial response is that the work of protection doesn't happen at the traumatic event or after the traumatic event. The work of protection is what we do before that happens, when we are creating what Cornel West called buffers, right? That's how we protect, especially young people, right? Pouring into them before they have those types of interactions. It won't make it, they'll still feel it. It'll still be really, really hard, but then we will have already laid the foundation to ensure that they will be okay throughout the process. That's my initial thought. I'm a parent, so we can't protect our kids from everything. So how do we best protect them? It's by doing our very best to prepare them with the skills we think they need, so that if they run into something really hard, they at least know they can come to us and we can help refill whatever was leached out by that experience, or we can point them in the direction. So I think that's the work that we really want to make sure, that's how we build a beloved community. We want to make sure that we are doing that work daily to those people that we interact with on a daily basis, so that when they run into those interactions, they think, oh, maybe I'll check in with so-and-so, or maybe you'll hear about the reaction and you'll reach out to them and they know they have an ally and a friend because you've built this relationship and this trust prior to the event happening. So it doesn't just feel reactionary, like, oh, I feel bad because this happened to that person, but no, I know this person actually cares about me and I'm really appreciative of their support.
And I think we also need much more critical thinking about how you educate within a beloved community so that people have the necessary strategic resources to act in an appropriate way. So we need teachers that understand trauma theory. We need students who understand how trauma impacts them and can potentially impact them. And in order for that to happen, you need parents and families and teachers who can help provide that core instruction. That is a reason that universities and good public education and private education has to be vibrant, vital, and informed by the very best knowledge that we have from the social sciences and from the humanities and from psychology and the like. Otherwise, we don't build a strong populace capable of identifying and mitigating social harm.
Hi, Russell Johnson, University of Chicago. So my question is, I could easily imagine somebody hearing this description of the beloved community and thinking, yes, that's right. That's exactly why we need to be teaching the Bible in schools. And that's why we need to have the 10 Commandments in courthouses, et cetera. And the sort of vision of a theologically inspired polity as a motivation for religious and Christian nationalism, specifically as a means to that end. To like, we need to get, who would hear this and think like, yeah, we need to get more kids in churches so they're formed in Christian principles like Dr. King was, that sort of thing. So my question is, I mean, how do you think about the tools of religious nationalism being a possible step in the direction of something like the beloved community? Is that a way that can be taken, or is there something about the nature of the kind of people we want to be that resists that sort of imposition?
So when I think about your question, I think immediately about those thinkers, philosophies, ways of life that were in conversation with people like King and Thurman. And if you look at King's letter from a Birmingham jail, you see how not only classical Christian theology, but Western philosophy and a host of other strands are detectable within it. And that says something to me about King's way of thinking and also about the norms for engaging complex issues within the institution that formed him, within the Black church. And I think you see elements not just of classical Christian theology, but also of trauma-informed experiential common sense that are derived from traditional African religions, African American religions, mother wit within the Black community and the like. And so when I think about how we do this, agape is a starting point, at least as I think about it, for thinking about beloved community. It honors, in a sense, the roots of the notion of beloved community, or one particular root. But it can't be the last word. In some sense, in a religiously pluralistic environment, we have to be capable of entering into dialogue about the nature of the common good with people who represent a variety of religious traditions and philosophical traditions. And to negotiate that common ground, as it were, so that we don't take on the negative elements that are associated with an exclusive way of thinking about Christianity or any other religious tradition or exclusive and narrow ways of thinking about nationhood. And that takes a good bit of time, and it's going to take a generation of theologians and religious thinkers who are willing, in some ways, to step toward the boundaries of their established traditions and maybe outside of those traditions to engage in that kind of thinking.
And I agree with you.
My name is Mike Forbes. Mike Forbes. I'm a fellow here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Mike Forbes. Oops, sorry. I'm a deacon at the Fellowship of the Inspired Leadership Initiative here at Notre Dame. I'm a fellow. And I knew John Lewis. John Lewis walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and he was a member of the SNCC, and he used to get in a little bit of trouble. But John Lewis was a great guy. And we have a bill in the Congress for black voting, and we can't get it passed. And it's named after John Lewis. And when the Democrats were in the majority, they couldn't get it passed. And now the Republicans are in the majority, and they can't get it passed. And it's a basic bill about voting. In fact, as some of you might remember, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act. And then the Supreme Court threw it out. And we named the bill after John Lewis, and we still can't get it passed. Now, that is one of your basic things, is the right to vote. So what I was really going to say was, and the dirty little secret is that this is about white privilege. I think, Keona, of your grandpa who knew how to deal with a white man and the white people, but he was a guy that we want to get back to basics. We have to get back to basics, and we have to understand that the only way we're going to win, and win if we wish, is by going back to basics and doing what we need to do, because it is really unfortunate. But right now, we are in the fight of our life. We are in the fight of our life.
Thank you for that.
Yes.
Oh, there's.
Yeah. Name's Max. I associated with the Catholic worker in town. I was curious. One of the things that I'm quite concerned about with the administration, they don't just seem interested in dismantling the current higher education system, though they flirt with it a lot. They also seem interested in taking over it and using its structure to promote patriotic education and all these other things. One of the things I wanted to ask you guys about is what are the boundaries and barriers that you set up so that you know that you are not somehow, well, say that there are patriotic curriculum education things that come out, and there's an effort to include all voices, all minority LGBT voices in a conversation about how racism and sexism and homophobia are over. So this is like inclusion in a propagandistic project. I think some of the language that we use here today could get co-opted, and how do you avoid that? What are the barriers that you set up so that you know that you aren't heading down a path where your project is getting co-opted by the right?
If I can just be honest, I have stopped trying to apply logic to the way that people co-opt things. Like I don't understand. So I am going to defer to you because this is the question that I wrestle with. You know, if you can't rely on facts and you can't rely on the truth, how do you? What tools are left at our disposal? Hugh?
This is where I think the advantage of being within an intellectual community committed to the unfettered search for truth is an advantage. And being at an educational institution should, and traditionally has, ensured that you have a group of colleagues and a collection of disciplines capable of looking critically at any document, any intellectual development. And I think we have that certainly here at Notre Dame. I hope that there will be other institutions that see themselves committed to this incredibly important task. I mean, the question you raise is a good one. How do you keep even the best of ideas from being co-opted and used in ways that are less than salutary in terms of promoting the common good? I think that requires all of us to be actively engaged in looking at every instance where something like this might be taking place, and in terms of being good stewards of our own intellectual property and ideas, of our curricula and the like. And that, you know, that's something that is likely to create some degree of consternation on the part of all of us. And yet, it's something that we have to do. I mean, as a faculty member in our Africana studies departments, you know, I'm part of a discipline that was an uninvited guest to the humanities in the 1960s. And so one of the things that we're engaged always in doing is corrective intellectual discourse. And it doesn't always meet with favorable embrace from those who are a part of the intellectual mainstream, but it's work that we consider we absolutely have to do. You know, I'll tell you a story. Several years ago, I thought, you know, I play in a blues band. I'm an African-American Bible scholar. And I thought, wow. And I teach in a theology department. So what would happen if I created a course called The Bible, the Black Church, and the Blues? Because those are three areas of discourse that have traditionally been in conversation with one another, even though the conversation is not at all times acknowledged. And, you know, I had a few people look a little bit askance at me and say, good God, man, what is that? And, you know, felt it was my responsibility to explain exactly why this would be an important area for students in our theology department to be familiar with, and why it's important for us to think about how disparate universes of discourse are brought into conversation with one another and for the benefit of the common good. So, you know, I think that there are instances where we'll have to think about how to take unpopular stances or how to think differently, how to think somewhat outside the box, and to defend those ways of thinking and being in the world for the benefit of the larger world. So I think that's one concrete example of how this can take place.
Colin Leach, Boston. What is the relationship between Christian nationalism and football?
That's funny. So believe it or not, I actually wrote my Ph.D. on, just kidding. I mean, I did look at football, and I looked at race in football, so not specifically Christian nationalism. But as you know, historically, obviously, this idea around, you know, Blackness and sport and athleticism and all of these issues have been around for a very long time. And I think it's important to understand that it was not by accident that these narratives around Black athleticism were created. Obviously, you can go back to Jesse Owens. Obviously, even before that, prior to that, there was less concern and issues around Black athleticism. You have Black golfers and tennis players who were very successful prior to. But I think in an attempt to explain how Jesse Owens might have been done so well, a lot of the eugenics narrative was, African Americans were closer to their primitive selves, and therefore, they were swinging on branches in the jungle, and that's why they're faster. And those lies have permeated through time. When I was teaching a course at the University of South Florida, I had a student, completely well-meaning. He pulled me to the side and he says, "Hey, is it true that Black people have an extra muscle in their leg and that's why they run so fast?" He says, "Because I ran track and every time I get beat, that's what my friends would tell me." And so this idea around athleticism and Blackness was contrived when we talked earlier about, trying to inspire divisiveness with these contrived groups. It was done purposefully, and it has lingered through time. Years ago, I did a research project with 8th graders. This is how long ago it was. I had them bring in the magazines that they look at, and pull out the images that they consume so that we could see how they form identity in relation to the images that they consume. And without fail, their perceptions around athleticism, their comments about, well, I can't be a good athlete, I'm Asian. Like those things permeate through time. So when we think about sport, in my mind, especially high revenue producing sports where there's a larger percentage of African American athletes, the evidence is relatively clear that race still matters. I don't know if that answered your question, but it didn't. Yeah, that's my experience with race and sport. As far as Christian nationalism, even when you think about Colin Kaepernick, I think that's another example of this idea around, he's kneeling, he's disrespecting our flag. That's just a further example of race permeating and mattering in sports.
So, sport and Christian nationalism. So, is sport or football a manifestation of Christian nationalism? Is the stadium a temple? I would say that, for some commentators, yeah, it really is. Kind of like the mall is also a temple. So I think sport, whether it's football or America's pastime, baseball or basketball, to some extent, they're reflections of those things that we hold to be most central in terms of our identity and our ways of being in the world. So in America in the 21st century, is football in general, and are perhaps certain franchises more closely aligned with popular notions of Christian nationalism? Maybe so. I think of the fervor in my youth. I grew up in Baltimore, for the Dallas Cowboys and what they might represent, in terms of being America's team and reflecting all those things that were considered to be essential in American life. I don't have an answer to the question, but certainly there are things that suggest that sport in general and that football, perhaps in particular, and maybe even baseball, are closely aligned with or deserve to be investigated as manifestations of particular Christian and nationalist ideologies.
Hi, my name is Zach Taylor, University of Chicago. I just want to press a little bit following up on Max's question, and thank you, by the way, for creating this space for these remarks. We just saw that Columbia University more or less capitulate to the Trump administration's demands in light of funding that $400 million in funding that they were denied. We floated the possibility that a conference like this might not be possible next year. You both are leaders at this university. Do you have a sense of how Notre Dame or other Catholic institutions might respond to similar kinds of pressure that was put on Columbia to address a wide range of policies, curriculums, things like that? I'd just be curious to hear if there's some kind of plan for what to do in that kind of situation.
I'm going to bow out to the Vice President for Institutional Transformation.
All I can say is that those of us within our own administration, as would be the case at any other Catholic institution or other institution, are looking very carefully at the national landscape. And it's only been a day thus far that Columbia's decision was made. And it, I can say personally, I was taken aback. Whether a conference like this would be possible next year, I have no indication that there would be a limitation placed on what we can do. Up to this point, we've continued to do what we have pledged to do as an institution. Conduct research, teach, continue our work fostering belonging and inclusion, and we've not backed away from that. So I can't speak on behalf of the trustees or others with regard to that question. It's a really complex and difficult issue. And we'll continue to look at what the implications are and position ourselves in ways that are consistent with the law of the land.
Do we have time for
last question over here that she's been so patiently waiting? Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Ellen van Stichel from Belgium. So I'm here as kind of an outsider, and it has been very interesting and fascinating to be here, not just in terms of research interest, but really to try to grasp of what is going on here, because honestly, in Europe, we don't understand, and we cannot believe that this is actually happening here. And of course, we have our own issues with two horrendous wars going on in the backyards of Europe. My question for you would be, do you see any role for a transatlantic alliance to tackle the issues that you are dealing with? And if so, how would that look like, both inside and outside academia? Thank you.
I think, clearly we believe in coalition building, and obviously transatlantic coalition building is equally important. The impacts of what's happening here, we understand cross borders, and it matters all over the world. At least I understand that. So to answer your question, I think coalition building is the way that we move forward. How we go about doing it in this really turbulent time. Every day we are, bombarded with new things that we have to consider, new challenges. So I don't have an answer right now for how we would do that. Hugh, do you have thoughts on?
No, I agree with you that international coalition building among communities of conscience is really important. And, I think we have the means to do so with social media. And we would probably do well to think about how to leverage those opportunities for ongoing conversation about issues that really matter. You know, the world in many respects is much smaller than it used to be. And with communication, at least at this point, possible through a number of platforms, community building, even in a digital space, is better than no community building at all.
I will just add that Appadurai has this theory around communitas, this idea that we connect with each other in community around varying identities, right? So you take, for example, I'm from Florida, I went to Florida State, I would consider myself a Seminole, right? Irrespective of boundaries, and how communitas allows us to blur boundaries. And I do think that there are opportunities to do this work. I think we just have to be really intentional and strategic as we begin the process of building a community of conscience, and then growing it from within.
We please thank Hugh and very rich conversation.